Hello, this is Grant Hughes of Grant Hughes Investigates on YouTube. Please hit that like button, share the video, and subscribe. Today's video is regarding the Idaho 4 murder case of Ethan Chapin, Xander Kernodle, Madison Mogen, and Kaylee Gonzalez that took place on November 13th, 2022 in Moscow, Idaho in the early morning hours between 4:08 and 4:20 in the morning. Now, I think the homicides took place between 4:13 and 4:18 in the morning, and that would have given him time to do blood spatter mitigation before and after to minimize the amount of blood that got in his vehicle. But today's video is regarding the knife sheath. Last night I was on Court TV, and before my segment, I was able to watch, follow along. If you're there about 15 minutes early, you can watch the previous segments waiting for your own segment. Well, while watching that, they said that all four victims' DNA were on the knife sheath. And that seems totally contradictory to all of the information that was out there. In fact, I had never heard that. I've always thought that by reading these documents that it was Kaylee Gonzalez, Madison Mogen, and then it was obviously Brian Kohberger's DNA was also on there. So let's just pretend that that's true for a moment. That would change everything, and I think the entire theory of the case would have been different in terms of sequencing. It would mean that if he'd gone upstairs and killed Madison Mogen and Kaylee Gonzalez first, he would have then had to have gone downstairs and killed Xander Kernodle and Ethan Chapin and brought the knife sheath back upstairs and place it on the bed. Now, that fits my theory that he left it there as a calling card, but that doesn't make sense with any of the other information. And I think it's less likely, but still a possibility, that he left the knife sheath there as a calling card, given the fact that there's aspirated blood, it seems to be on the back of the knife, which would mean that it was on the bed and then like he put the knife down and then he was attacking Kaylee and Madison, and then the coughing up of the blood got on the back of the knife sheath. So it wasn't like he killed them and then he goes, okay, let me put the knife sheath down. The sheath was there and then the blood hit the back of that. And then the other scenario would be that he killed Xander Kernodle and Ethan Chapin first, then went upstairs and killed Madison Mogen and Kaylee Gonzalez and left the knife sheath there, either accidentally or intentionally. But that doesn't make sense either, because Dylan Mortensen saw Kohberger coming from the living room area, and then he went into the kitchen and left the house, and that matches up with the dog barking, etc. So it just doesn't make any sense at all, and I think that was an error. And I thought I would just put this video out to show you precisely what is said in the documents. Okay, so let's get started on that right now. So as we see in the documents, it says item 1.1 was the swab of the front strap of the knife sheath. The DNA profile obtained from item 1.1 was determined to be from an unknown male, Ethan Chapin, and they obviously redacted some other names, are not the source of the DNA on the item. This DNA profile was entered into Combined DNA Index System CODIS to be routinely searched against the database. The case agency will be notified in the event of a profile match. Now, we know this right here is Brian Kohberger. This is exactly what they did with his DNA. They have an unknown male. They have the entire sequence, and they were able to upload it to CODIS. And they did not get a match. And if you remember also in the documents, Bill Thompson gave permission to do forensic genetic genealogy or investigative genetic genealogy on that DNA sequence. And then, so that absolutely is Brian Kohberger right here. This male profile in 1.1, that's the key swab in the case, is Brian Kohberger. And here is where they were swabbing. On that, see that there where I have it in, I don't know if that's pink or fuchsia color there, but you can see this is where they swabbed all around that strap and the button, etc. And that was Brian Kohberger's DNA. All right, now item 1.2 was a swab of edges on handle portion of knife sheath. So the partial DNA profile obtained from item 1.2 indicates a mixture of DNA from 3 individuals, at least one of which is male. Due to the low level results and limited data, no comparisons can be made. And so that actually makes sense. Maybe that's Brian Koberger's DNA and Madison Mogen and Kaylee Gonzalez. We don't know because there was so little DNA, they couldn't make a comparison. And the portion they swabbed on this one was right there on the sides. See right there? That's the location they swabbed on 1.2. And then we move over to item 1.3. That was the swab of the edges on the blade portion of the knife sheath. The partial DNA profile obtained from item 1.3 indicates a mixture of DNA from at least 2 individuals, at least one of which is male. Due to the low-level results and limited data, no comparisons can be made. So they just didn't even have enough DNA to do any comparisons, but they could tell from the mixture that at least one of them was a male. That's likely Koberger. There just wasn't enough DNA to do any comparisons at all. And here is the front of the knife sheath, and that is the portion right there that they swabbed in 1.3 and did not get any sort of viable DNA to determine whose precise DNA was, but they were able to determine it was a mixture of at least 2 people and that one of those individuals was a male, so it's likely Koberger, but there's no way to tell. It was such a minute amount. Now this portion here is interesting. It is item 1.4, swabs of stains on back of knife sheath. The DNA profile obtained from item 1.4 indicates a mixture of DNA with a major profile which matches that obtained from the known reference sample of Kaylee Gonzalez. Assuming a 2-person mixture, the DNA profile is at least 757 septillion times more likely to be seen if it were the result of a mixture of DNA from Kaylee Gonzalez and an unrelated randomly selected individual than if it resulted from 2 unrelated individuals randomly selected from the general population. Madison Mogen is a potential. Now, using the word potential minimizes the extreme likelihood, saying potential. Madison Mogen is a potential contributor to the minor component of this mixture. Assuming a 2-person mixture, this DNA profile is at least 48.6 quintillion times more likely to be seen if it were the result of a mixture of DNA from Madison Mogen and an unrelated, randomly selected individual than if it resulted from 2 unrelated individuals randomly selected from the general population. Now right here is important too. Ethan Chapin, Xander Kernodle are excluded as contributors to this DNA mixture. And they weren't in any of the other mixtures at all. So what this is really saying is that Ethan Chapin and Xander Kernodle's DNA isn't on the knife sheath because none of the other swabs, 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3, I guess you could say 1.2 and 1.3, that it's possible that the unknown DNA is theirs. It's just incredibly unlikely given the sequencing of how the crime went down. All right, so the blood on the back is not Ethan Chapin or Xander Kernodle's as well. Now here is the back of the knife sheath that they swabbed after noticing, obviously, that there was very fine misting of blood on the back, and you can see it really clearly in this image right here. If I zoom in, see these little tiny dots there? Those are blood samples, and after swabbing back here, they were able to determine that the major contributor was Kaylee Gonzalez and that the minor contributor was Madison Mogen. And again, just using this is the outline of where they swabbed right in this area here. So I think it's pretty obvious at this point that the only DNA that's verifiable on the knife sheath comes from Brian Kohberger, who's on the button snap, the strap, and the back of the sheath that has Kaylee Gonzalez and Madison Mogen's blood on there. All right. So in conclusion, I want to say that on Court TV, where they were saying all 4 victims' DNA was on the knife sheath, that was inaccurate. But it's easy, reading through a lot of the information in these documents where it's hard to interpret some of the information. This segment here, though, that goes over 1.1 through 1.4 is very easy to understand, very clear, and just in summary, item 1.1 is the most significant swab. That is where they had Brian Kohberger's DNA, and they were able to put the DNA into CODIS and then use the same DNA to do investigative genetic genealogy, which located Brian Kohberger as the suspect in the case, given the fact that the knife sheath was left there. Now we know later that Brian Kohberger ordered a K-bar knife on Amazon back in, I think, of March of 2022, and he also purchased a sharpener and a sheath at the same time. And so that's why this is all significant, because his DNA is on the button snap of the exact make and model brand of a knife sheath that he purchased, and it was found at the crime scene. And then it also turns out he drives a white Elantra, and that white Elantra was seen driving around doing loops. I just put out a video on that the other day. If you want to go check that one out, it's pretty interesting. All right, and then on 1.2 and 1.3, those are the sides, the handle portion of the sides and the blade portion of the sheath on the side, and those had DNA. 1.2 had a mixture of 3 individuals, but not enough DNA to figure out whose DNA it was, and at least one was a male. And then 1.3, same situation, but it was at least 2 contributors. One was a male. And they weren't able to determine, do any kind of genealogy or anything on that low level of DNA that they had. And then 1.4 was the misting of blood on the back of the knife sheath, likely from coughing. And that turns out to be the major contributor is Kaylee Gonzalez, and Madison Mogen is also on there as well. All right, so that is all I've got for you guys on today's video. I appreciate you watching. If you could hit that like button for me, leave a comment in the comment section, that would be great. And as I always say, until next time, be safe out there.